I'm Amanda Knox, and you're listening to Hard Knocks. Welcome to Hard Knocks, everyone. Today's episode has me speaking with Rebecca Lemov, a Harvard historian of science, about her newest book, The Instability of Truth: Brainwashing, Mind Control, and Hyperpersuasion. So obviously a fascinating topic for our times, for all time. We talk about the difficulty of people accepting that our minds are actually quite pliable and malleable. We talk about the difference between soft and hard brainwashing, coercive persuasion. We talk about free will. We talk about her research as being a investigation into her own self, and how, whether or not intelligence actually can protect us from manipulation. We talk about the destabilizing of faith in institutions and how that impacts our understanding of truth. We talk about the conditions that lead to brainwashing. We talk about how tech and AI play a role in how we're going to be interpreting objective truth in the future, and what is the relationship between subjective and objective truth. And of course, then we round about everything by talking about the trauma of brainwashing, the trauma of coercive control, and how long it took for us as a society to recognize that trauma is a word that we should apply to it. I hope you enjoy this. I really did. I think this is a fascinating topic, just in general. But in the times that we are now, when we're all really concerned with misinformation and how we might be being influenced by things, I think this is a really pertinent conversation to be having. But I just wonder, ahead going into this conversation, have you encountered the same problem that I have encountered? Which is when I go and advocate about, coercive police interrogation techniques, for instance, I am consistently met with resistance by people who don't believe that anyone could be coerced into believing or doing anything that they don't actually want to do, that there is this resistance to the idea that brainwashing is even a thing. And I'm wondering, have you, as you have been going about telling these stories, have you encountered similar resistance?
Yes, definitely. I mean, that's kind of at the heart of it. It's remarkably persistent. Seemingly, it goes in many guises. But I mean, I covered all these different case studies going back to the Cold War, and then looking at cult influence and Patty Hearst's abduction, and also the effects of social media. And they're all at different scale, different moments of time. But I think there is a common thread that took me I've been working on this for 2 decades, but it took me so long to really get it through my own head, this kind of resistance that I even shared in sometimes. It's a kind of like, but really, really what happened? And surely, people couldn't be duped, or there's a simpler explanation, or I think there's a kind of it's like a self-protective device that people share in, which is like, I think at the heart of it is this couldn't happen to me, and I want to be reassured that true coercion isn't possible. So in the end, a lot of the scholarship is really about how brainwashing doesn't actually exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder if it's a similar, now that you're just saying it aloud, I wonder if there's a similar resistance, because I think that we like to believe that we all have free will, right? Like that's another persistent idea that we are all free to believe and say and do the things we do. And any idea that pushes back against that acknowledges or attempts to tell us that our minds and our spirits are more fragile and more pliable than we like to think they are, is something that is deeply threatening not just in a like a personal way, but even in like a spiritual way. Like, and I wonder, first of all, like, when did you become convinced and how that brainwashing and coercion were real?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess really it's been an exploration from the start, and I that's why I am drawn to scholarship. Is if I, there's a saying like all research is me search, and I had that question myself, like how free are we really? And I think my whole academic life, which wasn't really academic life, it was just me saying I want to keep studying this. I want to figure out the best way to investigate this for myself. How free are we really, and under what circumstances? And because it seemed like in surprising ways we don't actually make big choices in our lives, and we're so much more circumscribed. I had that instinctive sense, and you could see it if you look at, I don't know, just influence campaigns of various types, or if you look at the history of the social sciences, they're all about to what extent can we make people want to do the very things that society requires them to do. So if society requires a certain number, people to fit them, like you could say, round pegs into square holes. I mean, how do we get people to actually want the thing that is socially necessary? So that social engineering question was one I started out with. And then at some point, I guess early on in this dissertation research, before I even started writing, it became a very personal question for me, just in things that were happening in my life in my late 20s. And then it's continued to play out that way, because I think there are just more and more layers as you go on. Like, you don't solve the question, you just continue to ask it in different ways.
Okay, well then let's ask it. What is brainwashing?
In one sense, so brainwashing has had many definitions, and it kind of, when I started, it was really a cartoon, and I thought I'm drawn to it because it seems like an extremely, something that nobody talked about in a serious way, and nobody was really, people would use it as a joke, like, oh, that seems like a relic of the Cold War and possibly of the early 70s, and the obsession with subliminal messaging and whether people were coming after our brains in different ways. But it didn't seem to have, so people took it so unseriously that I was drawn to it, because it just posed in a kind of ridiculous way. But the way the original scholars are very, very, it was at the heart of our national defense and military and highest levels of policy in the 1950s in the U.S. At the pivotal moments in the Cold War, and really brainwashing was the threat that people were vulnerable to a kind of programming of sorts, and it would be ideological ultimately, but that the enemy possessed these weapons, and that a simple definition that the experts of the time used that I kind of like is coercive persuasion. So it's not simply, what happened later in prisons where people, and earlier, torture. It was really the sense that under certain conditions, it's not so much the simple application of brutality, it's a kind of psychological edge to it that people come. Sometimes just if they want to survive, they come to participate in their own oppression. And so that's the coercive persuasion. It kind of gets to that combination.
Yeah, until you mentioned the cartoonishness of it, I had forgotten until this very moment that brainwashing and mind control was a big part of the movie Zoolander. Do you remember?
I totally do.
Totally, like he gets the song turned on and then he becomes like a homicidal agent, like it's incredible. And he's like walking the runway, but then he's like, ah, and that's what we think of when we think of mind control, because that's how it's been represented in media. But as a lived experience, it's a very different thing, right? So yeah.
But that's a great example. I'm happy that it intruded on your
Yes.
thoughts. Well, it's such a 90s movie, Zoolander. And Ben Stiller, yeah, I used to show that in my class because it was just so
Okay,
delightful.
amazing.
The little clips of him becoming an assassin. Well, he's sashaying down the runway, then turns into an assassin, and that really, it does have that cartoonish quality, as if like a switch could be flipped on and a person could become merely at the disposal of someone else's plan. And that actually, the Manchurian Candidate idea was part of it from the beginning. So it's both cartoonish and it partly, I guess, cartoonish because it's so hard to take seriously.
Right. Right. And it's almost as if like that representation of it is meant, like you said, to convey the unreality of it. It is like, nope, that couldn't possibly be a thing that really happened. Hence, ha ha ha. Mm-hmm. Here we go. Can you tell me? So one of the things that I've heard, especially as it relates to your book, is different terms about like soft and hard brainwashing. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could maybe tell me what is meant by those terms and how that relates to, for instance, torture. Because like one of the things, so I primarily came into this topic because of my experience of being coerced into falsely confessing in a police interrogation. And, I don't know if you're familiar. Did we end up sending you our series on false confessions and police interrogations that we did on our podcast? No. Okay, I'll do that after this. But we did a whole like series talking about police interrogation techniques and how a person over time is psychologically broken down in order to believe and repeat back what they're receiving from police officers in an interrogation room. And that's where I'm coming from. And very often, again, when I try to explain what this situation is like from the inside out, I have to, like, again, a lot of times when I talk to people about it, they say, well, I would never, ever, implicate myself or someone else in a crime that I had nothing to do with unless I was being, like, tortured. Like, we have this idea of like, oh, if someone's like, putting screwdrivers underneath my fingernails, well, I'll say anything. But like the idea that it's less about like forcing a person to do something that they knowingly know is wrong, and instead like turning like, again, using terms like gaslighting and coercive and like sort of change what, I guess, yes. So tell me about like the spectrums of soft and hard coercion and first of all, how do we define those terms, and also how do we like relate to them?
Well, okay, that's a great question. I want to first say what they are, and then I maybe question the legitimacy of them. But first, I just came up with those terms because when I was teaching, I wanted to make a leap. When I first started teaching my class, I wanted to make a leap between these events of POWs, prisoners of war during the Korean War, who had been held and had extremely, they were deprived of food and they were force marched and they were pushed off hilltops and they were massacred and they, even before the re-education began. And I thought maybe I could design a class around teaching students things in the past, horrifying things that happened in the past, and then I could connect it to the seemingly mundane. So I called it hard brainwashing would be those POWs, or I didn't really talk about cults yet, but you could say people who are abducted and things like that. And then I was like, what is it? Could we do a thought experiment? And even these small choices we seem to each make every day and students may not think about, could they think about it differently if they had some conception of a bridge between hard and soft brainwashing? But I do find that these distinctions fall apart a bit because of you have both firsthand and journalistic experience in this area. And I think that coercion is itself never simple. And because we're human beings, like this example just came up in my mind. And as a process of working on this for years, I've also just studied the history of interrogation. And so I was watching Wolf Hall with my family, which is the story of Thomas Cromwell. And he had to extract confessions from, in the story of King Henry VIII, who was his king. He had to basically construct a false case against several young men. And in one scene, the young man who he needs to confess to having had extramarital relations with Anne Boleyn, the young man says, "You're not going to torture me, are you?" And Cromwell leans towards him at the table and he says, "No." But he puts his hands on either side of his head and he said, "But I could put my thumbs into your eyes right now and gouge down to the back, and you would say anything I want you to say." And he doesn't touch him aside from putting his hands on the side of his head. Like, the man is never tortured, but it's the idea that you're completely at the mercy of this person. And also maybe all the things that have led to that moment where you find yourself in that position that would lead someone to, he not only confessed, but they confessed so that they would be killed. But there's no other choice at that moment. So anyway, that just struck me as an example of how coercion, in the history of brainwashing too, sometimes it seems convenient to try to make a neat separation between those people who are tortured and those people who are brainwashed, but actually they completely, they're intertwined with each other. They're the same. Yeah, they're the same, really.
So can you tell me, in your research and looking at all these various different forms of brainwashing, what are the kinds of conditions that facilitate coercion of a person?
Well, one thing I like to add to, one of the main conditions that people talk about, and there's a famous book by Robert J. Lifton that's a great resource for, many people find it a great resource, Thought Control and the Psychology of Totalism, which was published in 1962. And there are there's 8 conditions he talks about. And one of the main ones is milieu control. So basically, total informational control of an environment, or very strong control, maybe not total, but within a certain circumscribed environment. And you could say maybe we all, to the extent we're siloed, we also end up in such milieu control. But I like to also think about, so before milieu control can be established, before a person finds themselves in such a controlled environment, often I found as a researcher that the person had gone through something I call ungrounding, which is just a situation that was so unanticipated and so upside down or so deeply destabilizing that by the time they got into that room or that situation, that milieu control, they were already deeply dissociated in a certain way, or I don't know how to say it, just really their sense of reality testing had been disturbed. And this happened to the POWs in Korea, some of whom were 17, 18-year-old, high school students, one semester who, joined up for whatever reason, suddenly find themselves in another country they didn't even know their country was at war with. They were unprepared. It's extremely cold. Their equipment, they're told they're fighting for the greatest superpower in the world, and their equipment is leftover rifles from the previous war that are twisted, and they can't even, their boots are falling apart and things. So that and they end up, nearly starving, being bombed by their own forces, being napalmed. So these things are so destabilizing to one's expectations of what it means to be a patriotic, to be a soldier, or just to even do something that your country's asking you to do, that I think ungrounding is really important, and we can all probably identify it in different, as a precursor.
I love that term ungrounding, because I've also spoken to, I have a friend who studies extremism and what drives people to become terrorists. And he also, again, it's that you see a similar thing where something has happened very recently that was destabilizing, that made you feel like the rug was pulled out from underneath you, and everything that you thought that you could lean on is now sort of under question. And that under questionness leads you to be more susceptible for some new ideological truth to take hold and to ground you again. And so that's where you see a lot of like people who otherwise had never been violent in their life being willing to strap, bombs to their body and walk up, into a building and try to blow it up. Like there are moments in every one of our lives where our innocence is sort of like is stripped from us, and we have to then recalibrate and adapt to a new reality. And it is in those moments when people are most vulnerable to coercion and to ideological manipulation. And so, I like to point out, at least in the scenario of like in criminal justice cases, like in my case, my roommate was just murdered. Like I hadn't, was going about being a young person, studying abroad, and then all of a sudden, oh my God, somebody that I knew that I just talked to yesterday is now dead. Like just that sort of like destabilizing moment, or even just like I think talked about other people who I know who actually had like no connection to, maybe like some crime occurred and they had no connection to it, but merely the fact of being brought into a police station and questioned about something that you know nothing about and being accused of something that you know nothing about is deeply destabilizing. And you're like, what's going on?
Yeah.
So
you had maybe never encountered death. You're so young, and it reminds me of another example I just read. In cults, one thing that happens in the recruitment strategy is you find yourself, so it's not so much the who of it, it's the when. I think often, people and there's a lot of accidental or you could say luck or circumstance or happenstance or fate, however you want to describe it, of someone who might find themselves in a position to be recruited, say from a cult. But there's a great account that draws on oral histories of a group called the Sullivanians, who were active from the 50s and 60s through the 80s in Upper West Side, and they're famous for being a psychoanalytic cult. Or they call themselves a commune. But one thing they would do is, and initially people had these they felt free. They felt like they were having positive outcomes, but they were often recruited by very destabilizing effects of joining therapy, and their therapist is telling them, well, now you have to go and sleep with 5 different members of our group. And maybe they'd been some of them had just come from seminary school, or, and it's because a lot of these eventual control mechanisms have to do with breaking just whatever grounding you have or training. And that can at first feel liberating, or the person can't believe it, or they suddenly have all this whole new friends. But what's interesting about the group is people ended up doing terrible, terrible things. Some of them sending their kids away, to these abusive boarding schools for years, and even when their kids came back, they wouldn't even speak to them because of the the control that the cult was exerting. So people can be vulnerable at certain moments. This can happen to anyone. We can all be destabilized because very few people can find their own grounding in every possible situation.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how do you convey to people how fragile all of our minds are? Because I think that, again, I feel like even those who are willing to acknowledge brainwashing of others, like to think that there are certain kinds of people who can be brainwashed versus other kinds of people. And I think there is some truth to the fact that some people are more susceptible, like if you're very young or if you are, not as intelligent. Like there are ways that you are more susceptible to persuasion. But even so, I truly believe that anyone has a breaking point. Even the most intelligent people can have their own intelligence used against them. And I wonder, how do you talk to people about, or is it important to you even to convince people that our minds are more fragile than we'd like to think they are?
Yeah, I think it's really important, because I wouldn't I wouldn't want my lesson to be brainwashing happens to other people. It's a threat. It's in sort of an exiling or a way of creating a separation. I actually have come to think of it as more of a window for self-examination. I really think it's most useful. I think it really is mostly useful in examining oneself ultimately, because it's so hard to know another person's experience. I also think I might be controversial here, but I've come to believe that intelligence has nothing to do with it. It does not protect you. This is just because I would say that, the Sullivanians are a great example. These were brilliant people. Went to the best universities. Some of them were, one of the members was Clement Greenberg, who's one of the great intellectuals of the 21st century, and many famous, but also very talented musicians, artists took part in this group. Of course, the group did degrade over time, but I think that intelligence doesn't protect you, partly because it's something that we think does protect us. We think, I'm too smart for that. I would never fall for that. I've got skills that will, that I would never be such a dupe. I would never be such a fool. And that's part of how maybe we also justify just the risk that is inherent in going outside every day and talking to people at the coffee shop, or accepting a dinner invitation or things like that. But the fact of the matter is, it's shocking how that it's shocking that there really is no protection, I guess. And I find that, like you, I guess I find a lot of wisdom from Buddhism and or Buddhist practices, I would say, more of examination, and it feels ethical to me to put myself in the story and to say, I'm not just some expert who thinks I know and would never be affected by these things, because I think we all are being affected.
This isn't therapy, but it might help you live better. On Hard Knocks, we ask, how do you move forward when life sideswipes you? How do you find meaning in the mess? If you're into those kinds of questions and want ad-free episodes, extra content, and essays to dig deeper, subscribe at amandaknox.substack.com. I can't promise I'll fix your life, but I can make you feel better about how weird it already is. Totally. One of the recurrent themes in your book is also the shame that is experienced by those who have undergone coercion and brainwashing, and how there is a rejection by society of these individuals. Can you talk to me about that? And is that another reason why you wanted to write this book?
Yeah, if it can, that's one, I would say it's one reason why I don't find it useful to talk about other, I am talking about other people's experiences, but to really ultimately not use it as a kind of cudgel to say this whole segment of the population is brainwashed. And it doesn't have anything to do with me because I think it's we're all connected. But shame, you can see it operating frequently. I mean, people who have left cults experience a tremendous amount of shame, and makes it difficult to talk about. It's something, it makes it difficult to reintegrate. It makes it tempting to go back. And I was even thinking of, I mean, there's so many things, so many examples, but one that springs to mind is, I mean, the Korean War was part of one of the U.S.'s, the war our country fought, that was the only one named the Forgotten War, in the sense that very little has been remembered about it. There are bookshelves full of accounts of what happened in Vietnam and the soldiers' experiences, but very little about the Korean War. And the one thing that was remembered was that this brainwashing thing had happened, and that the troops were somehow ignoble, that they had shamed themselves, and that every returning member of the military felt this, that's how they were seen. And one of them described he had been in a POW camp for 3.5 years, endured, horrors beyond imagining, had gone through re-education, and, somehow made it back. And then when he went out with his uncle to a bar I think it was in Kansas City, and the bartender said, and he said, "I'm just back from Korea. I was a POW." And the bartender said, "Oh, are you one of those brainwashed? You must be one of those brainwashed, fools or something." And the young man never spoke about it again until an oral, decades later, when a historian came along and asked to interview him, and he finally did. But they had symptoms for years of just like, he could never be in a closed room with other people, or he could never, just nutritional deficiencies. These things haunt people, but it often becomes difficult to talk about. And I think that's why it's useful to have others, to find some sort of community who at least knows your experience. You also find a lot of people talking about how no one will understand. Even before they leave, they'll say, nobody will ever understand this, and they despair. And maybe I could relate to that. I mean, I imagine
yes.
You could too. Yeah.
Yes. I you bring up the fact that the trauma itself of being brainwashed and everything that goes into it is a trauma. Then there's the extended trauma of feeling isolated because of having undergone that trauma. And yet, do we even associate brainwashing and coercion? Like, I feel like today, but very recently, we're hearing things in terms of trauma. Like, we talk about coercive control. We talk about like how there are victims of that kind of abuse. But like, that seems to be a really recent thing, the acknowledgement that coercive control is traumatic to the person who is on the receiving end of it. Why did it take so long for people to recognize it as a trauma? And are we still sort of working towards that?
Yeah, I mean, that became the core of my research, that question. Why? Because I realized, and it took me a decade or so in when I was teaching, I realized none of these experts, who are some of the greatest psychiatrists, psychologists, greatest and also maybe infamous people who were unleashed by the military and the government and universities to understand this problem. They sometimes called it brainwashing, sometimes they call it mind control or re-education, or, to understand what had happened to the men and later women who underwent this. None of them ever used the term trauma. They never spoke about trauma. And maybe I thought at first I was like, of course they didn't. In the 50s, nobody understood how trauma worked. In the 60s, it was seen as incredibly rare. And a friend of mine who was a psychiatrist who was trained in that era, he said, we were trained to expect to never, maybe in your whole career, you would run into a traumatized person once or twice, and that would be someone who had been burned over most of their body, or they had something so unusual happen to them that that would be the one striking thing that you would see. Or a POW, but then I was thinking, these men were POWs. They had experienced, many of them lost 50% of their body weight or had to amputate their own limbs, just to survive because there's no medical care. Things like, unimaginable trauma. Also the trauma of the experience there and being abandoned by your family, by your country, all these things. And yet in the many pages and pages and miles of files, no one ever used the word trauma that I could find. So I thought, well, at least that's interesting or unusual. And why would that be? One thing is, again, it wasn't commonly seen. It actually hadn't yet been defined in the 50s in the modern sense of PTSD. So, and that's actually part of the story is Robert J. Lifton, who's one of the main mind control researchers. He then was instrumental in bringing about the DSM, the diagnostic definition of PTSD.
Yeah, manual, yeah.
He, which came out of the Vietnam War, so one war later. But nonetheless, it was still, at first it wasn't applied to women, and then it gradually does enter the culture in the 70s, but it's still there. People are reluctant to apply it to people who have been in coercively controlling groups, and certainly abusive relationships. Sometimes it's applied to women. It's called the battered women syndrome. So to explain women who are brutally beaten in relationships, but not so much. It's less the psychological dimension of why that relationship takes hold, and it's more about the beating, I guess, the physical. But of course, today we live. So I think there's a reluctance, and maybe this has to do with shame, with the sense the experts had that there was something mysterious going on with the pressure the government was exerting. The CIA deeply wanted to understand this thing called brainwashing, and they wanted to understand it in a more mechanistic way. They didn't really want, they're not interested in trauma. And also,
no, they just want to do it.
They want to be able to. They want to operationalize it. Yeah, they want to do it. And they don't. Yeah, they don't think of it as. It's part of the dynamics of interrogation. You don't think of it as traumatizing the person. You think about it as a righteous act. This is, described in. There's a great memoir called Guantanamo Diary about enhanced interrogation and how that. The people who carry it out don't think of themselves as traumatizing a person. They think about it as like a necessary, brutality or something.
Yeah, they're just convincing them.
They're finding they know the truth already. They just need the person to speak that truth. And if they're reluctant to speak it, you have to maybe use whatever methods necessary. But today, of course, we live in you could say peak trauma. People describe. I probably agree that there's nobody who isn't affected by some psychic wounds, trauma, or repository of unprocessed, difficult experiences if you think about that. So we live in a time that's much more trauma-informed. People who exit a controlling relationship or a high-demand group are often steered towards a trauma-informed counselor, and people write, complaining essays that we're seeing trauma too much, we're too aware of it. We're at peak trauma. There was a New Yorker essay about that, how too many books are hinged on the trauma plot and the idea that it all goes back to that early trauma. But I still argue that we still don't understand it properly, how it's operating. And it operates not only in the ways you're describing of being imposed in the process, but also that these groups or individuals can almost instinctively take advantage not only of your positive qualities, desire for justice, strengths, but also weaknesses, conflicts, childhood, issues.
Right. You mentioned truth, and your book is called The Instability of Truth, which it seems like that's a whole other can of worms to open up as well. What do you mean by the instability of truth, and does it have anything to do with the conflict between subjectivity and objectivity?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. So I I was talking to my mom one day, and I said, I was trying to describe my book to her, which I'd been writing for some time. And I said, I think it's about the instability of truth, not the lack of truth, or not the end of truth, or not the, fake, what do you call it? Fake truth or things like that. But really, it's about just that it's difficult to discern. There's a destabilization of, we could say in academia, truth regimes, like how we know what's true. And and that your point is an interesting one, because I do, my academic home is in a field called history of science, and I do write about the history of subjectivity, and I'm really interested in that. How do we even know what the objective circumstances are? It's not that truth doesn't exist. It's that our mechanisms for knowing it, our instruments, both internal and external, are flawed. And if everyone could easily agree, we wouldn't need to write histories, or we didn't need two historians to write about the same subject. There'd just be one. They did it. Now we know. But actually, we interpret our lives and also events around us. So, and I think that comes through in even in scientific modern science, where there are uncertainty principles built into the search for truth and then the nature of the universe. So anyway, I think this is also true, and I was trying to capture some of that. And anyway, when I was talking to my mom, she said, write that down, that phrase, the instability of truth. It reminds me of, I was just reading your prologue to your book, and I thought it was so delightful. You're describing your mom's prophetic moments. Yeah.
Moms in their prophetic moments. They say things that just land.
Yeah, I don't know. It's more like because she's a journalist, my mom. So she has an ear for a good phrase, and she's like, right. And not only did she tell me to write it down, she wrote it down, which was very helpful because I would have forgotten. So anyway, that's part of what I'm getting at. But I think it is something that I can continue to think about. And
I like the fact that it allows for you to have a conversation about the universality of these experiences, because again, I think everyone is tempted to say, well, if brainwashing is even real, only some people would ever be susceptible to it, when in fact, like, the point that you're providing all of these examples of how coercive control has been implemented in certain situations. And sometimes they have been more brutal than others, but ultimately we are all experiencing some kind of coercive control in both overt and less overt ways on a daily basis. And we are at this point where we're constantly having arguments over what is true and how to determine what is true and who to trust. Like, I wonder if you can talk to me a little bit about institutions or the gatekeepers of truth, and how do we individually and collectively establish what truth is if we do not have direct access to it?
Yeah, I mean, many institutions arise to perform that function, and I mean, my research has really been about those institutions such as modern post-World War II science, federally funded, carried out at universities, this kind of public-private partnership that's just been incredibly powerful since 1945, when Vannevar Bush published Science, the Endless Frontier. So it's the idea that we could know, and if we empower our public institutions, our public-private institutions, our university systems, we can get closer to some sort of truth, and it will also separately have yield benefits through medical research, through understanding cancer, through all sorts of, I mean, it's probably the largest funding structure the world has ever known in the pursuit of this kind of truth. But these institutions are breaking down right now. We can see that to be the case. They're destabilized. They were, I mean, not just the fact of the withdrawal of federal funding to many of them, but also these relationships are fraying, and they're sort of no longer self-evidently pursued. And I think that's one reason that I think people feel a lot of anxiety, because we had come to rely on the institutions we thought were stable. We thought at least we can look to our media to give us some sort of reliable reporting. At least we can look to the universities to do X, Y, and Z. But I mean, in many ways, these have been thrown into question, and not just since the most recent election, and really it's happened over time in the 21st century and maybe earlier. So there's a lot to say about that. But the question is maybe what is to be done? How do we build state? And I think that, so something that occurs to me is it's not just that we're being manipulated. I think that actually what it means to be human is that we're constantly being formed. We're in formation, and that can be taken advantage of, and it can lead to tremendous unfreedom. But it also is just kind of how we are. I loved looking at this great book by Norbert Elias, who was a German sociologist who wrote on the eve of World War II, and he talks about the history of etiquette manuals, and he talks about how in the 15th century and the 16th century, the manuals he looked at, they would say things like, make sure not to blow your nose in the tablecloth. And, because that nobody would like that. And it was, adults had to read these things, or make sure not to, make sure not to urinate in the corner while other people are eating of the room. Because I guess people used to do that. But he was asking, how is it that by a century later, you didn't have to give those books to adults, or you didn't have to talk to adults about that, but children still had to read those manuals. And today we don't have to read them at all. Like, most people don't blow their nose in the tablecloth or urinate in the corner of a room. So that he talks about it as what he calls sociogenesis and psychogenesis. In other words, we're shaped by these over time, too, by the societies and cultures, and also we're shaped in our psyches. And that process is incredibly powerful, but we just don't see it. We don't see all the ways that we act. And so I guess my instinctive thought is that even as institutions break down, we still live in a society, and that we are shaping each other, and that we need to be self-conscious about building up trust, I suppose, on a small scale.
Resilience isn't free. I mean, technically it is, but ad-free resilience, that's a few bucks a month. Subscribe at amandaknox.substack.com for ad-free episodes of Hard Knocks, plus bonus episodes and essays that help you turn adversity into insight and navigate the chaos of life with a little more clarity. Because sometimes all you need is a little insight, and someone who's already face-planted in the mud to talk you through it. Just now what came to mind was Fight Club, which I don't know, is that another one of those resources that you're like, obviously I talked to my class about both Zoolander and Fight Club?
I didn't get to Fight Club, but I could see it, but continue.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's just immediately I'm thinking of all the ways, talk about a book that's about people who have lost faith in institutions because they have been lying to them and selling them a lie, right? The main character talks about how, society convinced him that he needed to have a career, and he needed to have his yin-yang coffee table, and he needed to buy the things in order to be okay, and that was his life, and he was just on the treadmill until one day he blew it all up, or a version of his psyche blew it all up, and then the thing that makes him such a compelling cult leader is the fact that he is himself diagnosing how society has brainwashed people in the first place, and in particular men, to be these weak, docile, slaves to society. And he's giving them a rebirth into a new essence, or like into a new sense of purpose that taps into those like deep visceral parts of themselves that they have to repress in order to function in the society that they live in. But then of course it becomes itself its own conditioning and brainwashing, and he then just, like that. I think that's a really interesting examination of both, again, talking about the gatekeepers of what is truth, and how do you weaponize truth also.
Yeah, and how do you weaponize genuine insight? I mean, he has a genuine critique. And yet, and we see this all the time in cults. Also, it reminds me of a student of mine when I was teaching at the University of Washington, which I did a while ago, but that's where I first started teaching the brainwashing class. And there was a student, we were reading, and this was a class about ethnography. We're reading one about boxing, and, which just the whole it was about an anthropologist who taught himself to become a boxer, and how revelatory it was for him. But this female student in class said she was boxing, and this was really unusual at the time. And she said, "There's nothing as clarifying as being hit in the face," or something like that. And there's something very, it's powerful about breaking down and sort of viscerally or physically rooting. You're sort of rooting a new possibility, and that you see that in the film. But then it also raises dangers of abuse, and you see many such groups that do start with really powerful critiques, legitimate critiques. I mean, even the group that abducted Patty Hearst, they had a lot to say, and they were not totally wrong about, the systems they were critiquing. It's just the way they went about it would turn out incredibly pathological. And I think we may be seeing, or already in, a kind of a moment of resurgence of small and large such groups.
Mm-hmm. So when you're talking to your students about, recognizing coercive control in their own lives, what are you usually pointing to?
Well, I guess I hope that the class, the structure of the class, going from these, incidents in the past that seem, at least you feel like you can get a handle on it and we're not so emotionally attached to them, that they can apply that to the present. I do advise them not to go join a cult as part of their research project, which a couple of them have wanted to do.
Okay, they're like, people used to go into the insane asylums. I'll just go into my version of that. Yeah, okay.
I mean, I have tremendous, researchers do try to do that. And there's even a couple of cases of people like joining QAnon to do, underground research, but unfortunately getting converted. So, you have to have like a really
That's fascinating.
You have to have a healthy respect for I think if you do overestimate your intelligence and your canniness or something like that, you can find yourself in difficult. So I guess it is teaching certain humility about it, and also just awareness of the dynamics, and also maybe ways to ground oneself. I mean, I haven't taught the class in a few years, so I'll have to.
Well, I mean, it sounds almost like be careful who you surround yourself with and what ideologies you surround yourself with. And at the same time, like, one of the messages that we see nowadays is that echo chambers are really dangerous. And so we should sort of allow ourselves to be influenced by many different sources so that we don't become brainwashed by one singular echo chamber. How do you square that with also the message of, but maybe don't go into a cult, be open-minded, but not too open-minded. Like, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a paradox. And, but I also think that maybe the problem isn't ideology. This was another of the things that took me so long to I feel like articulate for myself is that the problem is not the ideology, it's the emotional, it's the emotional engineering that there's no list. There's not even a list of what is a cult. So when I say students wanted to join a cult, they wanted to join a particular group or just go and do research spend a couple days in a certain group or that, had a reputation. But also, there's one, even the most dedicated anti-cult groups can never make a list of what is a cult, because it depends on the person, partly the person's experience, how much they're targeted, what ends up happening to them, and also those groups can be very litigious. But so I focus on, I guess, emotional self-knowledge, and also the lesson that not to be paralyzed with fear, but to feel that to have enough to be able to check in, I think, with how something is resonating emotionally and even physically when you're encountering. Because I think, it used to be thought that people couldn't be recruited online and that the internet would solve the problem of cults. I guess, deprogrammers thought that for a little while. But it turns out that digital spaces are very good for recruiting, TikTok even, and all sorts of, thinking too about dissociation and maybe understanding the extent to which, how easy it is to dissociate, and maybe ways to bring yourself to even just simple ways to bring yourself to notice it, and to, whether it's through breathing or feeling your feet or just, taking breaks and various other forms of grounding. I find meditation to be very grounding, but, some people, it can also be incorporated as part of abuse, so.
Right. Nothing is safe.
Yeah.
Nothing and no one is safe.
Yeah.
Alas. Is that the ultimate message? Just that, I'm even thinking about, like, one of the reasons why it's so difficult to put a pin in what a cult is because many of the institutions that we have faith in can also be described using the same kind of terminology that we would use to describe a cult, which is the negative. Like, it's an institution. It has a hierarchy. Like, it has an ideological perspective. It attempts to convince you of that ideological perspective. It might even convince you to try to act and be a missionary of its ideological perspective. And it seems to sound a lot like a lot of the institutions that people really care about. And so where do you draw the line? Is it possible to draw the line anywhere? Or is it simply like are cults just a thing, and some of them fit in with our society in a functional way, and some of them don't fit and therefore are labeled cults because they're just dysfunctional, as they relate to the broader society? Like, is that the issue? Is that?
Yeah. I used to make jokes about Harvard being, when I taught the class I teach, I would make a joke about the Harvard being a cult, because it certainly has many of the qualities. And now that's a serious allegation people make, so it's not even funny anymore. And I do think there are elements of academia that are, concerningly, I don't know. It's just, this was actually pointed out by some of the great scholars of the 20th century on totalism, is that they left Eastern Europe, they left, at great cost, lives behind the Iron Curtain, East Germany, these incredibly minutely controlling systems, surveillant and authoritarian, and then they resettled in like Czesław Miłosz, the Polish poet, ended up in California, and he said he appreciated his life there, but he said, I'm seeing these things also here. There is no place that's free of them, and it's more about an opportunity for understanding. And I guess I do come back to something like my own personal conviction in it is that these are forms of suffering, and institutions do bring about suffering as well as opportunities, so that just to be very aware of them, and they offer many learning opportunities. It's like you may learn the hard way, or you can learn in any number of ways, but in the end, I do kind of have, like, I don't have a dark view. Ultimately, although one could say that this material is very dark, I just feel like it's potentially possible, and I think your example shows this, to have insight from one's experience. Yeah, even coercive, even horrifying ones.
Yeah. One question that I forgot to ask earlier was like the why question of why we're seeing a destabilization in our trust in institutions today. And do you think it's simply because we now have a more there's more transparency, we can see better into our institutions and therefore see their flaws and then call them into question? And if so, do you think that technology is helping us get closer to more perfect knowledge of things, or is that also itself a kind of illusion?
I mean, I do think transparency, the availability of recordings, the availability of records, and the release of records. Although the 20th century, there was a tremendous amount of secrecy, and one thing I read about is the CIA's MK Ultra program. The only reason we really know about it is that the head of the program neglected to destroy all of the financial records, but really the files were thoroughly destroyed. So there's a limit also to what we can know, but because of that oversight, it's in the record, and for a long time people didn't really write about it either, just because it seemed so outlandish. But it was seen. I feel like it was seen as, I mean, in university life, it was seen as maybe useful to be a counterbalance to the power of the government, to see ways that to offer criticisms of U.S. policy when it had brought about when it had violated the country's own ideals and things like that. In cases of the use of these technologies of mind control, coercion, and interrogation, and use of LSD and various other things, to abrogate human rights and of its own citizens and others. So that seemed like a useful thing. But after, I think there gains a kind of momentum, and I think that institutions start to become destabilized, not only from without, but also from within. I don't know why that is. There seem to be cycles in these things, and maybe they accumulate after a time, a certain amount of hypocrisy or rigidity, like they're no longer growing, they're sort of senescent to some degree. I just do think it's remarkable to see things that I thought would never be destabilized, like these lines of scientific research being pulled apart, like in a year, billions of dollars removed from labs. I mean, I don't necessarily know what will emerge instead. So I think it's good to to be curious about that. But so I think part of it is increasing transparency, but we also live now in an age of apparent total transparency, but at the same time, now we live at a moment when evidence is increasingly unbelievable. So AI can retroactively create archival evidence that supports a false historical event, and this is a huge challenge. So
yeah, I don't know how to overcome that, because at the very least, you think there's a video, like we have like a video of what happened or what didn't happen, but now we don't even have that. Like what, again, who becomes the gatekeeper of the truth if it's like, even if we can't trust our own eyes, like that's I think a scary reality that we don't have the answer to, but that we should be thinking about if we're not already thinking about it.
That's kind of my next question. I mean, if we remove standards for adjudicating, I mean, if the instability of truth becomes further destabilized, which seems to be happening, what then do we rely on? Where does one gain any kind of ground or common ground with others? It's a really I don't know.
Well, it sounds like the only way to do that is for everyone to sort of collectively decide what narrative they want to be true. But that has its own dangers down the line, because what if the collective truth is a completely bonkers thing that isn't real? Like I think, one of the things that I've discovered in my own life is that sometimes really, really untrue narratives are nevertheless compelling to have mass appeal. And if we don't have any kind of way to adjudicate truth, then do we become more reliant on compelling narratives, whether or not they are, in fact, objectively true?
Yeah, there seems to be evidence that that's true, that is the case, that people are drawn to. I mean, there are whole fields of like narrative economics and just the study of narrative, because it does seem that, I think because we're confronted with so much information, I mean, the too muchness of information is, something everybody can relate to. Whereas in the past, it was just, certain people who could go around complaining, like, it's so hard to keep up with my field. But actually, there's just so much, you don't know what newspaper to read or what sources to, where to even turn. So the kind of idea of curation, you kind of necessarily need to have a reducing valve. And then who are you going to trust to be that curator, that valve, or that story that will allow you to pick what you expose yourself to? And it really, I suspect that it will come down to developing one's own discernment, which is not simply an intellectual activity at all, but almost a spiritual, emotional, it takes place at all levels. And I think that will be the most valuable thing, asset, or sort of maybe it also just goes back to knowing yourself, as I think Socrates said. But
well, final thoughts, Rebecca?
I don't know. I guess I like to think about it. One funny thing that's happened, and I've been talking to many podcasts, and it's been so interesting. And one of them I talked to was a true crime podcast called Crawl Space. And these two hosts were just very lovely and fun to talk to. And then at the end, they're like, Rebecca, how do you spend so much time in this dark material? Like, your topic is really dark. And I was struck by the fact that that they have a podcast on murder. And, it's called Crawl Space. I can't imagine myself anything that seems more dark. But in a way, I guess I saw what they meant, because there's a kind of psychological element about all of this that can be really disquieting. But I guess I would end just by saying that I find it also a cause for optimism. Like, I have to feel that way. I do feel that way, just, I suppose, partly because of my meditation experiences, just seeing that there's always an opportunity, and we don't yet know, that kind of the way you're taught to not label things too early. This is good or this is bad, like to really remain curious about what is emerging. So I guess that's what I think about myself.
Awesome. Yeah. Again, like, is it psychological weakness, or do you have an open mind? Like, there are different ways of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's been so fascinating to speak with you, and I hope everyone reads your book, because it is destabilizing and we should all read it. So
yeah, thanks so much. It was great. I really enjoyed talking with you, and and am enjoying your book as well. Maybe they're good. They're a good complement to each other.
I think so. Yeah, I think so.